Captain Jake McAllister stood at the edge of the Xyrath throne room, his boots echoing softly on the cold metallic floor. He wasn't just any diplomat. He had traveled to more alien worlds than he could count, forging alliances, negotiating peace, and solving problems no one else could handle. But nothing could have prepared him for the Xyrath. The Xyrath were a race of towering insectoid creatures, with exoskeletons that shimmered in the dim lights of their vast, sterile city. Their leader, Queen Zarthal, was said to be the most powerful and ancient being in the galaxy. Legends told of her unmatched intellect and strength, as well as her cold, calculating approach to leadership. Unlike humans, who loved with passion, the Xyrath saw mating purely as a biological necessity. Pleasure, love, or desire didn't factor into it. Just reproduction, pure and simple. Jake took a deep breath and adjusted his uniform as the doors to the throne room opened. He wasn't nervous. He'd met important leaders before, but this was different. This wasn't just another species to represent. The Xyrath were ancient, their culture deep-rooted in traditions that spanned millennia. And now, Jake was here, trying to change one of their most fundamental beliefs. The idea that mating was nothing more than a cold, sterile process of reproduction. The throne room was vast, more like a hall than a chamber. On the far end, a massive, regal throne loomed, and there, sitting tall and proud, was Zarthal. Her 6 legs were spread wide beneath her glossy carapace reflecting the faint lights of the room. Her large, multifaceted eyes watched him with cold curiosity, as though Jake were some kind of insect under her magnifying glass. She was beautiful in an alien way, but her beauty was terrifying, a reminder of how different she was from any human. Jake didn't flinch as he approached the throne. He had been briefed on the Queen's reputation, but the stories didn't quite capture her presence. Zarthal wasn't just physically imposing. Her aura radiated intelligence and command. She was not a creature that could be easily swayed. Captain McAllister, her voice echoed, deep and resonant, but with a note of sharpness. You are here to speak of your species' customs, I assume. Jake nodded, swallowing his initial unease. Yes, Your Majesty. I believe there's much we can learn from each other, especially when it comes to the human understanding of relationships. Zarthal tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Relationships, she asked, her voice laced with disdain. To the Xyrath, mating is a biological function. Emotion is irrelevant. It serves a singular purpose, procreation. There is no need for affection or pleasure. Jake couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at her bluntness. I understand your perspective, but for humans, mating is about more than just reproduction. It's about connection. It's about pleasure, emotion, and trust. We find strength in our relationships, and we value the bond that forms between two people. The Queen's eyes narrowed, a flicker of confusion passing over her face. She didn't respond immediately. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the room the only sound. Jake could feel the weight of her gaze, almost as if she were searching for weakness, a flaw in his reasoning. Finally, she spoke again. Pleasure is unnecessary. It weakens the mind, clouds judgment. Emotions make one vulnerable. The Xyrath have thrived for eons without them. We do not need your weaknesses. Jake remained calm, but inside, his mind was racing. This was going to be harder than he thought, but he had known it would be. He didn't come here expecting Zarthal to change her views overnight. But he had an idea, something that might just be able to shift her perspective. He took a slow step forward, looking directly at her. Maybe, just maybe, Your Majesty, the reason you see emotions and pleasure as weaknesses is because you've never really experienced them for yourself. I'd like to show you a different way. Zarthal's eyes narrowed even further, her gaze now piercing. Show me, she asked, her tone dangerously curious. Jake didn't back down. Yes, I think the Xyrath could benefit from understanding more than just the act of reproduction. You might find something worth considering." Zarthal leaned back in her throne, her 6 legs twitching slightly as she studied him. Her voice was low but sharp. "You believe you can change my views on something so fundamental?" Jake met her gaze, unwavering. "Yes, Your Majesty, I do." For a brief moment, Zarthal said nothing, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, or perhaps curiosity, that made Jake feel, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to make her see the world in a different way. Jake McAllister wasn't sure what he had expected when he first arrived on the Kyrath homeworld, but he hadn't anticipated quite the resistance he was facing. The Queen had heard his words about human emotions, love, and pleasure, but she wasn't convinced. She stood firm in her belief that the Kyrath had survived for eons without such weaknesses clouding their judgment. To her, mating was a simple function. It had nothing to do with love, connection, or pleasure. It was only about ensuring the survival of the species. The next day, Jake was summoned to the Grand Council Hall, a place he had learned to fear. It was filled with high-ranking Kyrath advisors, each one more intimidating than the last. Zarthal, seated at the head of the room, glared down at him from her imposing throne-like seat. Her eyes were cold, but there was a hint of something more. Curiosity, perhaps, hidden beneath her stern expression. "Captain McAllister." Zarthal's voice was as sharp as ever, echoing through the chamber. "You have spoken of human emotions and the importance of pleasure. I am curious, but not convinced. Prove that your beliefs hold any value. You will participate in a series of tests." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had expected some sort of challenge, but nothing like this. The advisors surrounding Zarthal looked at him with a mix of amusement and skepticism, clearly unsure of how this human could possibly prove anything that would change their centuries-old traditions. "I accept," Jake replied without hesitation. "I'll do whatever is necessary to show you that emotions and pleasure are more than weaknesses." Zarthal's eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating focus. "We shall see." The first test was simple enough, or so Jake thought. He was placed in a room with a large group of Kyrath soldiers, each one towering over him, their sharp mandibles clicking in anticipation. He was told to demonstrate his ability to interact with them in a way that showed his emotional depth. Jake knew what they were expecting. A demonstration of human weakness, as they saw it. Instead, Jake approached the soldiers with calm and confidence, speaking to them with respect and even humor. He asked them about their lives, their families, their experiences. He was genuine, listening intently, and making an effort to understand their stories. The Kyrath soldiers, who were typically taught to focus only on duty and function, seemed confused at first. But slowly, something strange happened. They began to open up, sharing tales of their own victories and struggles, of the bonds they shared with their fellow soldiers. There was no visible emotion, no outward affection, but the exchange was oddly human in its complexity. Zarthal observed from a distance, her expression unreadable, her mind clearly working through what she had seen. She was not impressed, not yet. The Kyrath did not easily embrace such things as small talk or emotional connection. Jake wasn't surprised when the next test was much harder. Zarthal had Jake placed in a controlled environment, where he was to prove that human affection could somehow be a useful tool, something other than a distraction. The challenge was for him to demonstrate how affection could strengthen bonds between individuals, improving teamwork, loyalty, and even the effectiveness of a mission. Jake found himself in a simulated crisis situation, one where he and a few Kyrath soldiers were tasked with rescuing a group of hostages. The catch was that Jake had to rely on his ability to emotionally connect with the soldiers to get them to work together, as opposed to simply giving orders. It was intense. The Kyrath soldiers were logical, methodical, and focused on their task. But Jake pushed forward, relying on the human traits that Zarthal had already labeled as weaknesses. He encouraged the soldiers, not just through commands, but by acknowledging their fears, their doubts, and their strengths. He motivated them by connecting on a personal level, appealing to their desire to protect others. As the simulation progressed, something unexpected happened. The HFY soldiers, who had been so disciplined in their approach, began working together more fluidly. They started to cover for one another in ways that were uncharacteristic. They communicated not just through tactical commands, but through gestures of trust. The mission succeeded, and the hostages were saved. But what struck Zarthol was the method of success. The human's ability to emotionally connect had turned a simple operation into a triumph. Zarthol was silent for a long time after the simulation ended. Jake could feel her eyes on him, watching him closely, evaluating him. "What you have shown," Zarthol finally said, her voice quieter than before, "is interesting. But it does not prove that affection and pleasure are necessary. It only proves that they can be useful." Jake didn't let the comment discourage him. "That's a start," he replied, his voice steady. "Human connection isn't just about making things easier. It's about making us stronger, emotionally and physically." Zarthol considered this for a long moment, her mind clearly wrestling with the idea. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "there is more to this than I have realized." Jake knew he wasn't there yet, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. And in the cold, rigid heart of the HFY Queen, a small crack was beginning to form. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Ever since the simulation, Zarthol had been quieter than usual. Her cold demeanor cracked just a little, like a fine layer of ice starting to melt under the warmth of a fire. She still held onto her beliefs with the same iron grip, but there was something in her gaze now. Something that made Jake believe his efforts weren't in vain. He had spent the following days in constant dialogue with her, speaking of human customs, emotions, and the complexity of love. He shared stories of human connection, explaining how it had shaped his world, his history, and the way his species interacted with each other. Zarthol listened intently, her expressions unreadable, but Jake knew she was processing every word. It was on the fourth day of their discussions that the moment occurred, an unexpected event that would change everything. The Queen had summoned Jake to the palace gardens, a serene and quiet place surrounded by towering alien trees. The air was thick with the scent of strange flowers, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves filled the air. It was a peaceful place, but Jake could feel the weight of the conversation ahead of him. Zarthol had been unusually silent, and he sensed that today something big would happen. As they walked through the garden, Zarthol turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Captain McAllister, you have spoken of human affection, how it binds people, how it strengthens them. Yet, I remain unconvinced. How do you truly know that affection is more than an illusion?" Jake took a breath, trying to choose his words carefully. He had come to admire the Queen for her intellect, her strength, and even her stubbornness. But he knew he was walking a fine line. He couldn't force her to accept human emotions. He could only show her, little by little, what it meant to be human. "It's not about knowing, Your Majesty," Jake said gently. "It's about feeling. It's about experiencing something that goes beyond logic or reason. Love, affection, connection. They're not things you can understand purely with your mind. They're something you experience with your heart." Zarthol stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Her large, dark eyes studied him intently. "Heart," she repeated, as if testing the word. "You speak of something I do not understand. The HFY have no such thing. We are driven by logic, by instinct. Emotions serve no purpose." Jake didn't look away, even though he could feel the weight of her scrutiny. He had expected this. The Queen was stubborn, yes, but there was also something in her that was starting to shift. He had to take a chance. Without thinking, Jake took a step closer to Zarthol. Her body stiffened, and for a moment, he thought he might have overstepped. But then, in a moment of boldness, he reached out and touched her, just lightly, his hand resting on her arm. He had done this with humans before, as a way to express connection, trust, and even care. But this was different. He was touching the queen of the Tyrath, a creature who had never known physical affection in the way humans did. Zarthol didn't pull away, but her eyes widened in surprise. There was no fear in her gaze, just confusion. She looked at his hand, then back up at him. The tension between them grew thick, like an electric charge in the air. Jake swallowed, knowing he had to continue, that this was the only way to reach her. Slowly, he leaned in, not aggressively, but gently, and pressed his lips to her cheek. It was soft, a simple gesture of affection. It was something humans did when they felt close to another person, when they wanted to show care without words. He didn't expect it to mean anything more than that. Zarthol froze. Her whole body went rigid as if she had been struck by lightning. Jake could feel the heat of her skin, the tension in her muscles. For a moment, there was no sound, nothing but the beating of his own heart. Then, almost imperceptibly, Zarthol let out a breath, as if she had been holding it in for a long time. "I do not understand," she said quietly, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. There was no anger, no rebuke, just confusion. "Why did you do that?" Jake pulled back, his chest tight. "Because, Your Majesty, that's what humans do. We show affection to one another in small ways. Touch, a kiss, a smile. It's a way of saying, I trust you, I care for you. It's not about logic. It's about something deeper." Zarthol was silent for a long moment. Her eyes locked onto his, and Jake could feel her trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had known she wouldn't understand right away, but he hoped that the simple gesture had made an impact. He had crossed a line with her, one that had never been crossed before, and as strange as it seemed, he could tell that something inside Zarthol had shifted. "You, humans are strange," she murmured, her voice almost reflective. "But perhaps there is more to this than I thought." Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had done what he could. He had shown her something that had never been a part of her world, the tenderness, the vulnerability, and the connection that came from affection. As they stood there in the garden, the air heavy with the unspoken, Jake realized that this moment, this forbidden kiss, had broken something in Zarthol. It hadn't just been an action. It had been a door opening. A door that, once crossed, could never be shut again. Jake had no idea what to expect after that moment in the garden. The kiss had been a simple gesture, but in the presence of someone as powerful as Zarthol, it felt like a monumental risk. Yet, as he walked back to his quarters that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The queen's eyes had softened just a little, and her voice had lost some of its usual sharpness. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had reached her in a way no one else had. The next day, Zarthol summoned him again. This time, the call wasn't for another test or challenge. It was for a private meeting in her chambers, a place Jake had never been invited to before. As he made his way to the towering palace, his mind raced. He had to be careful now. Whatever was happening between him and the queen, it was new territory for both of them. He had to tread carefully. When Jake entered her chambers, the atmosphere was different. The cold, sterile walls of the palace had been replaced by soft lighting and the subtle scent of alien flowers. Zarthol stood by a large window, gazing out at the alien sky, her silhouette sharp against the glowing blue horizon. She didn't turn when he entered but spoke as though she had been waiting for him. "Captain McAllister." Zarthol's voice was calm, almost curious. "You have shown me something I cannot explain. For the first time, I am questioning what I have believed for centuries. Why is it that humans value such things as affection and touch when they have no clear purpose?" Jake felt a mix of relief and nervousness. It was clear she was struggling to understand the emotions that had become second nature to him, but at least she was engaging with him now, rather than dismissing everything he said as weakness. "Your Majesty," Jake began, choosing his words carefully, "it's not about having a clear purpose. It's about the connection it creates between people. Human affection, love. It's not about survival. It's about finding strength in each other, facing challenges together, and sharing joy in ways that logic can't always explain. Zarthal turned to face him then, her eyes studying him with an intensity that felt almost like a physical force. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the queen was trying to reconcile what she had seen with her own understanding of the universe. "You told me that affection makes humans stronger," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I have seen strength in my people, Captain McAllister. We have survived for eons without it. What makes you so certain that affection is necessary for strength?" Jake took a deep breath. He knew this was his moment to make her understand. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's not just about survival, Your Majesty. It's about living, truly living. Humans are not only driven by instinct. We have a capacity for deep connection, for care, for love. Those emotions do not make us weak. They make us resilient. They allow us to face loss, pain, and hardship, and come out the other side stronger." Zarthal was silent again, her gaze unwavering. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, her ancient mind that had never allowed for such concepts to flourish. To her, emotions were a luxury, a distraction, something that only served to cloud judgment. And yet there she was, listening to him with a kind of seriousness that he hadn't expected. "You speak of resilience," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "I have seen the way your species clings to one another, even in the face of impossible odds. Perhaps there is more to this than I understood." Jake didn't respond immediately, afraid to break the fragile moment. Instead, he let the silence linger. He had planted the seed, and now he had to wait for it to take root. He wasn't sure how long it would take, or if Zarthal would ever truly accept what he was saying. But he was beginning to see the faintest signs of change in her, tiny cracks in her icy exterior. After what felt like an eternity, Zarthal took a slow step forward. "You have shown me your way of thinking, Captain. I admit, I do not fully understand it, but I am willing to explore it further. Perhaps there is something in these emotions that can help the Tyrath." Jake's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a full acceptance, but it was progress. He had made her question everything she had known. And that, he realized, was a victory in itself. But then Zarthal added, her voice quiet but still firm. "However, Captain, understand this. The Xi-Wrath do not need affection to lead. We are a people of strength and purpose. We do not live for pleasure or emotional indulgence, so do not expect me to change overnight." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I never expected you to. But I believe the Xi-Wrath can learn to incorporate some of what I shared with you, without losing your strength or your purpose." For the first time, Zarthal allowed a slight flicker of something like acknowledgement to cross her face. It wasn't a smile, not exactly, but it was the closest thing Jake had ever seen from her. "You are an interesting human, Captain McAllister," Zarthal said, almost as if to herself. "I am intrigued to see where this path will lead." Jake couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The journey wasn't over. But with each conversation, each moment of understanding, he was closer to showing Zarthal that human emotions were not a weakness. They were, in fact, the key to true strength, and he was more determined than ever to prove it. The days that followed were a mix of tension and surprising moments of clarity. Zarthal had agreed to explore the idea of human emotions further, but there was still a certain distance between her and Jake. Despite her curiosity, her belief in Xi-Wrath traditions ran deep, and every conversation with her felt like walking a tightrope. She was willing to learn, but she wasn't yet ready to let go of her convictions. Jake had returned to his quarters that evening, reflecting on their last conversation. Zarthal had not rejected his ideas outright, but she still held fast to the belief that emotions were a luxury that Xi-Wrath could never afford. He knew it was going to take more than words to change her mind. He needed to show her, somehow, that affection and connection were not just human traits. They could be universal strengths. As he lay on his bed, his thoughts were interrupted by a message from Zarthal. She had arranged a meeting in the council hall, a place Jake knew all too well. The last time he'd been there, it had been filled with skepticism, but now he had a different kind of feeling about it. Zarthal seemed less cold, less unapproachable than before. He arrived early, trying to prepare for whatever might happen. As he entered the vast chamber, he saw Zarthal waiting for him, her posture rigid, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of curiosity. "Captain McAllister," Zarthal greeted him, her voice low. "Today, I wish to test your claims. I have arranged for a demonstration, but not in the way you might expect." Jake's heart raced. A demonstration. What did she have in mind? He was ready for whatever challenge she would throw his way, but he couldn't help but wonder if she had some new test lined up to see if he would fail. "Very well, Your Majesty," Jake said, trying to keep his tone steady. "What do you wish for me to demonstrate?" Zarthal motioned for him to follow her. She led him to a large open arena, a place used for Xyrath warriors to train and test their combat skills. Jake looked around, confused. This was not the setting he expected for a discussion about emotions. "We are going to fight," Zarthal said, her eyes fixed on him. "But it will not be a battle of strength. We will test the power of unity, of cooperation and trust. You will fight alongside my warriors. Together, you will face a simulated enemy." Jake couldn't help but smile. This was unexpected, but it made sense. He had always spoken of the strength found in human connection. Now, Zarthal was forcing him to prove it. If he could show that cooperation, empathy, and trust could lead to victory in this arena, it might make her see the value of the very emotions she had once dismissed. The simulation began. Jake was paired with 3 Xyrath warriors, each one formidable in their own right. At first, they seemed skeptical, keeping their distance from him. Jake, knowing the importance of emotional connection, approached them with respect, not as a superior, but as an ally. "Work with me," Jake said to the closest warrior, a tall Xyrath named Drax. "We're in this together. Let's cover each other's backs." Drax grunted but nodded. The Xyrath, although tough and independent, had always been trained to think individually. Jake knew that was their biggest obstacle. They didn't believe in teamwork the way humans did. As the simulation progressed, the fake enemy, a horde of aggressive, robotic creatures, began to surround them. The Xyrath warriors fought with precision, but they were not coordinating as well as they should have. Jake could see the gaps in their defense. He needed to act fast. "Drax," Jake shouted, "move left. I'll cover the right." Drax hesitated for a moment, but then followed Jake's command. As they moved together, Jake shot down a few attacking bots. The other warriors quickly adapted, shifting to cover each other's blind spots. Soon, they were working in harmony, their actions almost synchronized, something Jake had seen countless times among human soldiers in battle. The simulated battle ended with the team standing victorious. But Jake knew it was not just the strength of the Xyrath that had won. It was the trust, the communication, and the bond they had formed in those few minutes. They had learned to rely on each other, to care about each other's success as much as their own. Zarthal watched from the sidelines, her gaze fixed on Jake and his new allies. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no denying the change in the air. For the first time, she seemed to recognize the power of connection, the very thing Jake had been trying to show her. Jake wiped sweat from his brow and turned to Zarthal. "You see, Your Majesty, it's not just about individual strength, it's about working together. The strength of unity is what makes us powerful." Zarthal stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she examined the warriors who had fought alongside Jake. "I see," she said, her voice soft, but filled with something new, respect, perhaps, or at least the beginnings of it. "This unity you speak of, it has power. I did not believe it before, but now I see how it works." Jake could feel a sense of accomplishment building inside him. He wasn't there yet, but he could see that Zarthal was beginning to understand. She was beginning to see the value of the very emotions she had once dismissed as weaknesses. "You have much to teach us, Captain McAllister," Zarthal said slowly, her voice taking on a tone of contemplation. "Perhaps the Xirath can learn from you after all." Jake didn't know where this would all lead, but for the first time, he felt like he was making a real difference. The battle wasn't over yet, but he was no longer fighting alone. The weeks that followed the battle simulation were filled with subtle but significant changes. Zarthal had not completely embraced the idea of human emotions, but there was no denying that she was starting to understand their importance. Jake could see the difference in the way she interacted with her people, even the smallest adjustments. She spoke more openly with her advisors, and her decisions seemed to carry more empathy than before. But there was still resistance. Zarthal was a queen, and her role had always demanded strength, control, and unwavering logic. She had spent centuries leading the Xirath, without the need for emotional bonds, and that was hard to let go of. Even so, she kept asking Jake questions, probing deeper into the ways human connections worked. And each time, Jake responded with patience, knowing that change wasn't something that could happen overnight. One evening, as Jake sat alone in his quarters, the familiar hum of the palace echoed in the background. He had just finished speaking with Zarthal about a possible diplomatic mission with an allied species, but his thoughts kept drifting back to their conversations about human emotions. They were still in the early stages of understanding each other, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was on the verge of happening. That night, just as he was about to rest, a message from Zarthal arrived. It was short, but it carried weight. "Meet me at the Obsidian Garden. I have something to show you." Jake's curiosity was piqued. The Obsidian Garden was a sacred place for the Xirath, a private, serene area known for its dark, reflective surfaces and alien flora. It was a place where only the highest-ranking individuals were allowed to go. He had never been invited there before, and the fact that Zarthal had personally asked him to meet her there told him this was not a casual request. When he arrived, he was surprised to find the garden bathed in soft, glowing light. Zarthal stood in the center, her back to him, facing the intricate black stone sculptures that seemed to shimmer in the low light. She turned as she heard him approach, her expression unreadable but strangely calm. "Captain," she greeted him, her voice soft yet firm. "Thank you for coming." Jake nodded, trying to remain composed. "Of course, Your Majesty. What is it you wanted to show me?" Zarthal motioned for him to follow her as she walked toward one of the sculptures. It was a beautiful, towering structure, resembling a large tree with twisting branches that seemed to reach toward the stars. But what caught Jake's attention was the way the branches seemed to pulse with a faint glow, as if they were alive. "This tree," Zarthal began, "is ancient. It is said to have been planted by the first queen of the Xirath, a symbol of the strength and unity of our people. It represents our connection to the land, to each other, and to our history." Jake walked closer, his eyes studying the glowing branches. There was something mesmerizing about it, something that felt both foreign and familiar. He could sense a deep reverence in Zarthal's tone as she spoke, and it was clear that the tree meant more to her than just a symbol of the Xirath. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've told me," she said after a long pause, "about emotions and connection. And I realized something." Jake waited, his heart racing a little. This felt like a pivotal moment, like Zarthal was about to share something important. "I have spent my life leading the Xirath with the belief that emotion only weakens us," Zarthal continued. "That affection and vulnerability are things to be avoided. But you were right. True strength comes from connection, from knowing that you are not alone." Jake's breath caught in his throat. Had Zarthal really come to this realization on her own? Had he truly made her see that emotions, rather than being weaknesses, were powerful forces that could unite her people? "I don't fully understand it yet," she admitted, her gaze turning to the glowing branches. "But I see now that there is something here, something that can strengthen us. I need to learn more, and I want to learn from you." Jake took a step forward, surprised at how deeply her words resonated with him. Zarthal had always been so proud, so resolute in her beliefs, but now there was a vulnerability in her that he had never seen before. It was almost as if she was asking for his help, not just in understanding emotions, but in changing the very foundation of her people's strength. "I'm honored, Your Majesty," Jake said sincerely. "But it's not just about learning. It's about feeling. The connection between us. It's not something you can force, not something you can study in a book. You have to experience it." Zarthal turned to face him, her expression serious. "Then show me," she said softly. "Teach me how to feel it, how to trust in it." Jake nodded, stepping closer to her. There was a moment of hesitation, but then, as if the weight of their shared experiences had finally bridged the gap between them, he reached out to her. He placed a hand on her shoulder gently, a touch that was both tentative and full of promise. He didn't force it. He let it be an offering, a gesture of trust. Zarthal didn't pull away. Instead, she met his gaze, her eyes reflecting something new: curiosity, hope, and maybe even a little fear. But there was something else there too, a willingness to try. In that moment, Jake realized that they weren't so different after all. The Xirath and humans, despite their vast differences, were both searching for the same thing: strength, unity, and connection. And if he could help Zarthal see that, then maybe, just maybe, she would understand the true power of affection and trust. "I'll help you," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "One step at a time." The following days were a blur of activity, but the change in Zarthal was unmistakable. She had begun to open herself to the idea that emotions weren't just weaknesses to be avoided. They could be a source of strength. As much as the Queen tried to maintain her usual sense of control, there was a quiet softness about her that hadn't been there before. Jake had noticed it in her manner, in the way she interacted with her people, even in the way she spoke with him. For the first time, Zarthal had begun to trust in the power of connection, and Jake had never been more determined to help her see that it wasn't just about human emotions. It was about something universal. Today, Zarthal had called for a special gathering, a meeting of the Xirath Council. Jake stood in the grand hall, his heart pounding in his chest. This meeting would be unlike any other. The council, once a place of strict logic and unquestioned authority, was about to experience something new. Jake didn't know exactly what would happen, but he trusted Zarthal. She had asked for his help in creating a new kind of leadership, one based on trust, connection, and shared strength. The room began to fill with the most powerful Xirath leaders, each one imposing and confident. Their eyes were curious, their faces unreadable. They had seen Zarthal's changes, heard rumors of her new way of thinking. But change wasn't easy for the Xirath. It would take more than a few discussions to convince them. Zarthal entered the room, her presence commanding as always. She was no longer the queen who stood alone at the top. She was now a leader who was willing to listen, to learn, and to connect. Jake stood to the side, watching her with a quiet pride. He knew how much this moment meant to her. "My people," Zarthal began, her voice strong but calm. "I have called you here today because I have come to realize that there is something we have overlooked. For centuries, we have ruled with logic, strength, and singular purpose. But I have learned that there is more to leadership than dominance. There is the power of unity, of trust, and of connection." The council members exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. They had never heard their queen speak in such terms before. Zarthal continued, her eyes scanning the room, as if measuring the impact of her words. "I had seen this unity in humans," she said, her voice softening. "Captain McAllister has shown me that true strength comes not just from our individual power, but from the bonds we share with each other. The strength we gain from trust, from working together, is greater than the strength we gain from fighting alone." Jake watched as Zarthal spoke, feeling a deep sense of pride. She had come so far, And now she was sharing her growth with her people. It wasn't easy, he knew. The HFY were proud and set in their ways, but this was the start of something new. Zarthal turned to Jake, giving him a nod of acknowledgement. Captain McAllister, I have asked you here today not only to teach me, but to help me teach my people. You have shown me that emotions are not weaknesses. They are the heart of unity. I ask you to demonstrate this, to show my people the power of working together. Jake stepped forward, his heart racing. He had prepared for this moment, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. This wasn't just about showing Zarthal the strength of human connection anymore. It was about showing an entire species the power of unity. I'm honored, Your Majesty, Jake said, his voice steady. Let's show them. Zarthal gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. She stepped aside, allowing Jake to take center stage. The council members watched him intently, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Jake knew they were expecting something spectacular, something grand. But what he had in mind was simple. He looked at the council leaders and then at Zarthal. I want to show you something, Jake said. I want to show you how strength grows when we trust each other. You've seen it in battle simulations before, but this time, we will not fight. We will cooperate, we will trust, and we will support one another. The HFY leaders were silent, but there was a flicker of interest in their eyes. Jake moved to the center of the room and gestured for a few of the council members to join him. Hesitant at first, they stood up and came forward. We will create something together, Jake said, not as individuals, but as a team. The council members exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect. But slowly they began to follow Jake's lead. They worked together, learning to communicate, to trust each other's abilities, and to share the task of creating something larger than any of them could achieve alone. It was a small exercise, but the results were undeniable. For the first time, Jake saw the council leaders, proud, individualistic beings, working together as one. When the task was complete, Zarthal stepped forward, her eyes glowing with something new. Pride, perhaps, but also something deeper, something she had never fully understood until now. This, she said, her voice filled with awe. This is true strength. Not the strength of the individual, but the strength of the whole. You were right, Captain McAllister. You have shown us the power of connection. Jake smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. He hadn't just taught Zarthal. He had helped the HFY see something they had never considered before. The strength of unity was not just an abstract idea. It was real, and it had the power to transform. Zarthal turned to her council, her voice full of authority, but also warmth. We have learned much today. From now on, we will rule not only with strength, but with unity. Together, we will build a future for the HFY. The council nodded, some with hesitation, others with newfound understanding. They had seen the power of working together, and though it would take time for them to fully embrace the change, the seed had been planted. Jake felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Zarthal standing beside him, her gaze steady and filled with gratitude. You have done more than teach me, Captain McAllister, she said quietly. You have changed my people. Jake nodded, knowing that the journey wasn't over. But for the first time, he felt confident that Zarthal and the HFY were on the path to something greater. They had learned the value of unity, and it was a lesson that would shape the future of their species. And with that, Jake knew he had fulfilled his mission. The power of human connection had made all the difference.